Good morning, crime community. I'm going to finish out reading Poisoner in Chief, a chapter called Feller Jumped. It's about Frank Olson. 5 days after being dosed with LSD, Olson was still disoriented. His boss at the Special Operations Division, Vincent Rouet, called Gottlieb to report this. Gottlieb asked him to bring Olson in for a chat. After their meeting, Gottlieb later testified Olson seemed to be confused in certain areas of his thinking. He made a quick decision. Olson must be taken to New York City and delivered to the physician most immediately tied to MK Ultra, Harold Abramson. Alice Olson was surprised to see her husband home from work at midday. I've consented to take psychiatric care, he told her as he packed a suitcase. Soon afterward, Rouet arrived. Alice asked if she could accompany her husband on the first leg of the trip. Rouet agreed. A few minutes later, he and Olson set off. In the car, Olson became uncomfortable. He asked where they were going. Rouet told him their first stop would be Washington, and from there they would fly to New York. There, Olson would be treated. Thanksgiving was just 2 days away, and Alice asked her husband whether he would become home in time for the holiday dinner. He said he would. In the Hot Shops dining in Wisconsin Avenue in Bethesda, the group stopped for lunch. Olson refused to touch his food. When Alice asked to encourage him to eat, he told her he was afraid that he would be served tainted food with drugs or poison. The belief that the CIA is poisoning one's food is a classic of the conspiracy-addled mind. In most cases, it may be safety-filled with the belief that aliens torment Earthlings by sending messages through their dental fillings. Olson, however, knew from personal experience that the CIA would indeed poison food. People with whom he worked made the poisons. When the group arrived in Washington, their car pulled outside an unmarked CIA building near the reflecting pool. Rouet went inside. Frank and Olson lingered in the car. They held hands in the back seat. Alice asked Frank to repeat his promise to return home for Thanksgiving dinner. He did. Then Rouet appeared and motioned for Frank to come with him. The couple said their goodbyes. As Gottlieb had directed, Rouet and Robert Lashbrook escorted Olson to New York. Aboard their flight, Olson was nervous and talkative. He said he felt all mixed up. Somebody kept repeating was out to get him. From LaGuardia Airport, the three men rode a taxi to Abramson's office in the Brink Towns house at 133 East 58th Street. Alice Olson had been told that the Abramson was chosen because her husband had seen a physician who had equally clearance security so they could talk freely. This was partly true. Abraham was not a psychiatrist, but he was an MK Ultra intimate. Gottlieb knew that Abraham's first loyalty was to MK Ultra, or he would have put it in the security of the United States, that it made him an ideal son to probe Olson's inner mind. Olson told Abraham that ever since the Deep Creek Lake retreat, he had been unable to work well. He could not concentrate and forgot how to spell. At night, he could not sleep. Abraham sought to reassure Olson, who seemed to relax afterward. Rouet and Lashbrook picked him up at 6 o'clock. Later that evening, Abraham joined him at the Sattler Hotel where they had checked in. He brought a bottle of bourbon and several tablets of Nembutal for use with alcohol. The four of them talked until midnight. Before leaving, Abraham advised Olson to take a couple of Nembutal as if he had trouble sleeping. You know, I feel a lot better, Olson said at the evening end. This is what I've been needing. The next morning, Rouet took Olson to visit the magician, John Mulholland. According to a later report in the New York Times, Mulholland may have tried to hypnotize Olson, leading Olson to ask Rouet several times what's behind this. By another account, Olson became agitated when he thought Mulholland was going to make him disappear like one of his magician's rabbits. A few minutes after arriving, he jumped from his chair and bolted out of the house. Rouet went after him. That night, Rouet and Lashbrook took Olson on a stroll along Broadway. They brought him tickets for the music called Me and Juliet. During the intermission, Olson said he feared being arrested at the end of the show. Rootwood scoffed and guaranteed personally that Olson would be home in time for Thanksgiving dinner the next afternoon. Nonetheless, Olson insisted on leaving. The two men returned to the Statler Hotel, leaving Lashbrook to enjoy the second act of Me and Juliet. He went to bed without incident. When Ruwet awoke at 5:30 the next morning, Olson was gone. He roused Lashbrook and was in a nearby room, and the two of them descended to the hotel's canaverous lobby. There they found Olson sitting in a chair and looked disheveled. He reported that he'd been wandering aimlessly through the city and had thrown away his wallet and identification cards. That day was Thanksgiving. A week had passed since Olson was given LSD at Deep Creek Lake. He still planned to return to his family for a holiday dinner. Accompanied by Lashbrook and Ruwet, he boarded a flight to Washington. An MKUltra colleague was waiting for him when they landed at National Airport. Ruwet and Olson got into his car for a drive to Frederick. Soon after they set out, Olson's mood changed. He asked that the car be stopped. "What's wrong?" Ruwet asked. "I would like to talk things over." They pulled into the parking lot at Howard Johnson's in Bethesda. Olson returned to Ruwet and announced that he felt ashamed to meet his wife and family because he was so mixed up. "What do you want me to do?" Ruwet asked. Let me go off by myself." "I can't do that." "Well, then, just turn me over to the police. They're looking for me anyway." After some discussion, Ruwet suggested that Olson might want to return to New York for another session with Abramson. Olson agreed. They drove back to Washington and made their way back to Lashbrook's apartment near DuPont Circle. Gottlieb had broken off his holiday plans upon hearing of his morning's developments, arrived soon afterward. Later reported that Olson seemed very mentally disturbed at this time. He talked in a clear manner, but his thoughts were confused. He again talked about his incompetence at his work, his hopelessness of anybody helping him, and the fact that the best thing to do was to abandon him and not to bother about him. Yet, given what Olson knew and his state of mind, that was impossible. Gottlieb ordered Ruwet to drive to Maryland and tell the Olson family that Frank would not be arriving for Thanksgiving dinner at all. Then he drove Olson and Lashbrook to National Airport and put them on a flight back to New York. After landing, the two scientists took a taxi to Abraham's weekend home in Long Island town of Huntington. Abraham spent about an hour with Olson, followed by 20 minutes with Lashbrook. The guests then left, checked into a guest house at nearby Cold Springs Harbor, and adjourned for a quiet Thanksgiving dinner. The next morning, Abraham, Lashbrook, and Olson drove back to Manhattan. During a session at his 58th Street office, Abraham persuaded Olson that he should agree to be hospitalized as a voluntary patient, not committed by legal authority, at a Maryland sanatorium called Chestnut Lodge. With that decided, Olson and Lashbrook left, registered at the Statler Hotel at one night, and were given room 1018A. Over dinner at the Statler dining room, Olson took Lashbrook that he was looking forward to his hospitalization. He mused about books he would read. Lashbrook later said that he was almost the Dr. Olson I knew before the experiment. The two returned to their room. Olson washed his socks in the sink, watched television for a while, and lay down to sleep. At 2:25 in the morning, he went out to the window. Police officers from the 14th Precinct appeared at the Statler Hotel moments after Olson hit the sidewalk on 7th Avenue. The night manager took them to room 1018A, opened the door with a passkey, and stood inside as they entered. The window was smashed out with only a few shards remaining. Lashbrook looked up from the toilet as the officer entered. It was all quite straightforward, he told them. We had been awoken by the smash of broken glass and Olson was gone. Beyond that, he had little to say. The officers considered the possibility of foul play, possibly involving a homosexual affair. "Would you happen to know where Mr. Olson's wallet is?" one of them asked. "I think he might have lost it a couple of nights ago," Lashbrook replied. "You're going to have to come with us to the station house." At the 14th Precinct station on West 30th Street, Lashbrook was asked to empty his pockets. He was carrying several airline tickets, a receipt for a payment of $150, signed by the magician John Mulholland, and note with names, addresses, and phone numbers for Vincent Ruwet, Harold Abramson, George Hunter White, and Chestnut Lodge, the Maryland sanatorium where Olson was to be hospitalized. In his wallet were several security passes, including one issued by the CIA and another granting him access to Inglewood Arsenal. The officers asked him to explain. Lashbrook said he was a chemist working for the Defense Department and that Olson had been a bacteriologist working for the Army. Olson became mentally unstable. He had brought Olson to New York to be treated by Harold Abramson. Then, driven by his inner demons, Olson had leapt through the hotel window. That was all, Lashbrook said, except for one important detail. This matter must have kept quiet for national security reasons. The detectives left Lashbrook alone while they checked his story. Rootwet and Abrahams confirmed it. A few more questions, the detectives told Lashbrook that he was free to leave but should appear at Bellevue Hospital later that morning to identify Olson's body. He returned to the Statler Hotel. Soon afterward, there was a knock at the door. The CIA fix-it man had arrived. For every secret service needs officers who specialize in cleanup messes. In the CIA in the 1950s, those officers worked for Sheffield Edwards at the Office of Security. Cover-up was directed in the hours and days after Frank Olson died, was a model of brisk efficiency. Immediately after Olson crashed through the Statler Hotel window, Lashbrook called Gottlieb to report what had happened. Gottlieb, in turn, dialed a secret telephone number that connected him to the duty officer at CIA headquarters. He reported that there had been an incident in the hotel in New York City involving a death and that it was required immediate attention. The duty officer called Edwards and told him that an agency employee assigned to an eyes-only project at Camp Dietrich had committed suicide in New York. The subject name was Frank Olson, he added. Edwards gave the duty officer two assignments. First, he was to call Lashbrook and tell him to move to another room at the Statler Hotel and to talk to nobody until we get someone there with him. Second, he should immediately summon both Gottlieb and Gottlieb's boss, Gib Gibbons, chief of technical services staff, to Courtier Eyes, an unmarked CIA building near the Lincoln Memorial. Both men were waiting for Edwards when he arrived at 5:40 a.m. They told him what had happened in New York. Edwards later reported that he questioned Dr. Gibbons and Dr. Gottlieb at some length on certain matters that had occurred prior to this incident. He knew that he was looking for. Edwards had been a co-conspirator of Bluebird, which carried out experiments with psychoactive drugs beginning in 1950 before MK Ultra was created. Under his questioning, Gottlieb revealed a key fact. Olson's CIA colleagues had given him LSD without his knowledge 9 days before his death. With the calm self-assurance for which he was known at the CIA, Edwards announced how the cover-up would unfold. First, the New York police would be persuaded not to investigate and to cooperate in misleading the press. Second, a fake career, a legend, would be constructed for Lashbrook, who, as the sole witness, would be questioned by investigators and could under no circumstances be recognized as working for the CIA, much less MK Ultra. Third, the Olson family would have to be informed, placated, and kept cooperative. Edwards had men to handle the first two jobs. The third was for Gottlieb. Find a trusted man to break the news to the new widow. Gottlieb said he had already done so. I spoke with Vincent Ruwet, chief of Dietrich's SO division, at about 3 a.m. and asked him to go to Olson's home. Gottlieb said he's probably there right now. Ruwet had the awful job of telling Alice Olson that her husband had just died violently, and also to begin the process of helping the family quiet. Light snow fell as they drove toward the wood bungalow at Frederick. Alice was overwhelmed by the news. She sobbed uncontrollably and collapsed on the floor. When she could speak, it was to say, "Tell me what happened." Rootwood told Alice that her husband had been in a New York hotel room and fell or jumped. through the window to her death. Her screams awoke her 9-year-old son, Eric. When he appeared in the living room, Woodward told him, "Your father had an accident. He fell or jumped out a window." That phrase came to haunt him. For years after that, I was completely stumped and dumbfounded by trying to resolve that alternative, Eric recalled. There's a big difference between a fall and a jump. I couldn't understand how either of them could have occurred or pushed. While Alice was being informed of her husband's death and her home in Maryland, Lashbrook was welcoming the CIA cavalry to his room at the Statler Hotel in New York. It took a form of a single officer in internal reports. He called it Agent James McSee. Later, he was identified as James McCord, whose daughter rear-ended me, got a free car out of it. Who could go on to become a footnote in America's political history as one of the Watergate burglars? McCord had previously been an FBI agent specializing in counterintelligence, making police investigations evaporate, one of his specialties. As soon as Edwards called McCord before dawn on November 28th, he swung into action. He took the first meeting plane to New York and arrived at the Statler Hotel around 8 o'clock. Lashbrook had just returned from his brief detention at the 14th precinct. McCord spent more than an hour questioning him, and then around 9:30 advised him to go to the morgue at Bellevue Hospital, as the police had requested. There he identified Olson's body. While he was away, McCord minutely searched room 1018A and nearby rooms. Shortly after noon, Lashbrook returned to the Statler Hotel. McCord was waiting. Over the next few hours, according to McCord's later report, Lashbrook made a series of telephone calls and appeared completely composed. One call was to Sidney Gottlieb. After hanging up, Lashbrook told McCord that Gottlieb had instructed him to go to Abramson's office at 9:15 p.m., pick up a report, and bring it back to Washington. That evening, Lashbrook and McCord emerged from the hotel and walked across 7th Avenue to Penn Station. There they met another officer from the CIA Office of Security who had come to believe McCord. The newly arrived officer, identified in reports as Agent Walter P.T., suggested to Lashbrook that they take a taxi to Abraham's office. When they arrived, Lashbrook said he wished to speak to Abramson alone. The agent listened through the proverbial keyhole. Upon closing the door, Dr. Abramson and Lashbrook started to discussion about security, he wrote in his report. Dr. Abramson was heard to remark to Lashbrook that he was worried about whether or not the deal was in jeopardy, and that he thought that the operation was dangerous, and that the whole deal should be reanalyzed. Lashbrook carried Abraham's report to Washington on the midnight train. CIA security officers in New York took care of the remaining details. The investigating police detective concluded that Olson had died from multiple fractures, subsequent upon a jump or fall. That became the official narrative. A bacteriologist from the Army Biological Warfare Research Center at Camp Dietrich fell or jumped to his death early yesterday from a 10th floor room at the Statler Hotel in New York. Olson's hometown newspaper reported. He was identified by a companion as Frank Olson, 43, of Route 5 in Frederick. Olson and his friend Robert Vern Lashbrook, a Defense Department consultant, returned to the New York Tuesday because Olson wanted to see a doctor about a depressed state. At a funeral, a barely composed Alice Olson greeted mourners as if in a daze. Among them were Olson's closest colleagues, to whom she did not recognize, made special efforts to console her. Afterward, she asked a friend who they were. That was Bob Lashbrook and his boss, the friends replied. They both worked for the CIA, you know. Later that week, Lashbrook and his boss called Alice to arrange a condolence visit. She agreed to receive them. Lashbrook introduced himself and then presented his boss, Sidney Gottlieb. Both told Alice that her husband had been a fine man and would be sorely missed. I really don't know why Frank did it, but I'll be glad to tell you anything I know about what happened, Lashbrook said. Gottlieb was equally solicitous. If you want to know more about what happened, He'll be happy to meet with you and talk. Alice later reflected on what might have been behind their visit. It was probably to check me out and to see whether I was handling myself and handling the situation, whether I was hysterical, she said, and I'm sure they left the house feeling ever so much better because I had been gracious in hospital to them. So that I must have played right into their hands and made them feel fine. Despite the successful cover-up, Olson's death was a near disaster for the CIA. It became close to threatening the very existence of MKUltra. Gottlieb, Helms, and Dulles might have been taking this as a moment for reflection. In light of his death, they could have reasoned further experiments with psychoactive drugs should have stopped, at least on the unwitting subjects. Instead, they proceeded as if that had never happened. They reflected their view of how vital MKUltra was. If it could provide the key to victory in a future war, something in the mirror as a single death would hardly be enough to derail it. Conspiracy theories aside, if Frank Olson was murdered, it may have been for the simplest reason. One simple concluded that more than a half a century later followed his Deep Creek Lake experiment, Sidney Gottlieb may have found himself with a man who was so ill that he was a threat to his program's security. The death of Frank Olson may have been a means to an end, the end to the threat to MKUltra. Although no one outside the CIA questioned the official story of Olson's death inside the agency, it was a stunning event. The CIA's general counsel, Lawrence Houston, who together with Dulles had written the 1947 National Security Act that created the agency, spent 2 weeks reviewing what he called all information available to the agency relating to the death of Dr. Frank Olson, and wrote a brief memorandum summarizing his findings. It is my conclusion that the death of Dr. Olson is a result of circumstances arriving out of an experiment undertaken in the course of his official duties for the U.S. government, and that there is, therefore, a direct causal connection between that accident and his death. It said, I am not happy with what seems to be a very casual attitude on the part of TSS representatives to the way this experiment was conducted, and to their remarks that this was just one of the risks running with scientific experimentation. A death occurred which might have been prevented, and the agency as a whole, particularly the director, were caught completely by surprise in the most embarrassing manner. Houston handled this memo to the CIA Inspector General, Lyman Kirkpatrick, an OSS veteran who had joined the CIA soon after its creation. Dulles had asked Kirkpatrick to investigate Olson's death, but he gave him a less than fully revealing account of what had happened. Some time ago, Dulles told him, Olson had participated in an experiment that might have involved LSD, and this experience may have contributed to his suicide. It was no suicide, man. He wanted to report, but impressed Kirkpatrick with the need for discretion. Senator McCarthy and other critics of the CIA would certainly seize on this case as if they suspected the truth. Besides, Alice Olson was soon to begin receiving survivor's benefits based on a verdict of death by classified illness, so that any other conclusion would create problems for her. Kirkpatrick interviewed several CIA officers involved in the case. Gottlieb was not among them. He was asked only to submit a written report and replied with 8 short paragraphs. A few sentences shed light on what he called his fairly close personal relationship with Frank Olson. Gottlieb estimated that he had met Olson 13 or 14 times over the previous 2 years at Camp Dietrich and at CIA offices. He was not asked whether he and Olson had ever traveled together or what their joint prospects had entailed. At Kirkpatrick's request, Harold Aberson, who had also known Olson for years, sought to treat him in the days before his death and was one of the last people to see him alive. Also wrote in an account of the episode. Kirkpatrick underlined 2 passages. In the first, Abraham reports that when he met Olson on November 24th, I attempted to confirm what I had heard, that the experiment had performed especially to trap him. Later, Abraham says that at their meeting the following day, Olson spoke of his concern with the quality of his work. His guilt had been retired from the Army for an ulcer and his release of classified information. Although these phrases eventually intrigued Kirkpatrick, he did not probe further. On December 18th, he handed his report to Dulles. It did not fix blame, but included a startling recommendation. There should be immediately established a high-level intra-agency board which should review all TSS experiments and give approval to any in which human beings are involved. Dulles, who knew more about MKUltra than Kirkpatrick, could not possibly agree to that. He did, however, agree to sign his brief letters admonishing the director of the technical services staff, Gib Gibbons, his deputy, James Drum, and Gottlieb. Hand carried to Gibbons, Drums, and Gottlieb. He wrote in handwritten instructions to an aide, have them note, having read, and return to Kirkpatrick for eyes only file. These are not reprimands, and no personal file notations are being made. In the first two letters, Dulles said he considered the unwilling application of LSD as an experiment with which you are familiar to be an indication of bad judgment. The one he sent to Gottlieb was only slightly sharper. I have personally reviewed these files from your office concerning the use of a drug on an unwitting group of individuals, he wrote. I recommending the unwitting application of the drug of your superior. You did not give sufficient emphasis to the necessity for medical collaboration and for proper consideration of the rights of the individual to whom it is being administered, like informed consent. This is to inform you that it is my opinion that you exercise poor judgment in this case. That's the end of that chapter. The next chapter is called Operation Midnight Climax. So it sounds like some people are getting to the truth, but it's been 62 years and it's still being covered up. So if you like and enjoy my truth talk here today, like and subscribe, and God bless all the family and children.